There are a ton of different ways to get logs, metrics, all that stuff from Kubernetes. There are certain endpoints, there are certain ways to retrieve logs, and then you can take those logs, those metrics, those traces, and you can pop them into a tool of your choosing. So for example, maybe you're using something like Prometheus and you want Prometheus to ingest metrics from your Kubernetes cluster. That way you can take action on them if something were to occur. Now, one of the biggest logs that we need to think about is the Kubernetes audit logs, which is primarily coming from the control plane, from the API server, collecting all of that information on what's happening inside of the cluster. Now, I think this is very important because a lot of people are overlooking this in today's world, especially with cloud services, because the control plane isn't, you don't have to worry about it. It's managed for you. However, you should still understand what's happening on the control plane and ultimately in the audit logs. And let's talk about why. What are audit logs? Well, by definition, and this comes from Kubernetes.io website, Kubernetes auditing provides a security relevant chronological set of records documenting the sequence of actions in a cluster. So what does that actually mean? Literally everything from you running kubectl apply -f on a YAML to applications, or containerized applications rather, that are running inside of Kubernetes, the control plane itself, any single thing that happens in your cluster, the audit logs retrieve if you set it up in that fashion. And we're going to talk about that in a second, and we're going to kind of show how that's done. Anything and everything that happens inside of a Kubernetes cluster gets recorded. And that's a good thing, right? Because if there's some potential breach in your Kubernetes cluster, you would want to know about it. So what's kind of the workflow here? Well, we want to know a few things. What happened? How it happened? When it happened? Where did it come from? What was the destination? So with these 5 things in mind, this is kind of why we want to look at audit logs in general. We want to understand, okay, this thing was created. Let's say, a pod was created and it wasn't supposed to be. Well, we need to be able to figure out what happened, how it happened, when it happened, where did it come from, and what was the destination. All of these things kind of encompass like what is happening inside of our Kubernetes cluster, why it's happening, who kicked it off, what was the purpose. That's the whole idea behind these audit logs. Now, one thing to keep in mind, by default, audit logs are not turned on. Now, in some cloud services, and we're going to take a look at AKS and Azure, and we're going to take a look at EKS and AWS. But if you're running Kubernetes on-prem, for example, and depending on the cloud service, audit logging may not be on by default, and you may have to turn it on. Okay, so if you are spinning up a new control plane, this is an example of the command that you're going to use. So, whatever tool you're using to spin it up, you're going to essentially provide an audit log path and an audit log policy. So let's go ahead and take a quick look at what a policy looks like, and then we'll go ahead and we'll take a look at some cloud services and see this audit stuff in action. All right, so taking a look here, this is an example of an audit policy. So this is going to be coming from the core API group, and we're going to be using a resource called policy, or the kind rather. And then here are some rules that we can set up. So for example, the request response level is going to be used for pods. We're going to then be collecting some metadata on those pods. So the log, the status, for example. And then we can also set up that we don't want to collect logs. So for example, we have the level here of none for both config maps, endpoints, and services. So right here, we're saying don't collect these logs, don't watch these logs, don't log these requests. And then we have another one right here that it's a request. So it's going to log the request body of a config map in the change in the kube system. So as you can see here, we have a bunch of different ways to actually capture logs, all different ways to capture logs, how we're going to capture them, even logs that we don't want to capture or requests that we don't want to capture. That's all available for us. And there's also a minimal version of this here. So if I just backtrack here for a second, this is also another policy, and this is a very verbose yet simple policy. And pretty much what this is saying is every single audit log capture the metadata. Now, as you can imagine, this is probably going to be a lot of data that's going to be ingested. And maybe you might want all of this data and you want to back it into something like Prometheus or Datadog or whatever solution you're using. So you can use something like this, collect every single log, every single audit log rather, and then make actions and decisions on it based on what's happening inside of those logs. So now let's head over to Azure really quick and let's take a look at policies in action. I'm inside of the Azure portal here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my AKS environment. Now with AKS, by default, audit logging is on. If you go down under monitoring into logs, and then you can ultimately query, something that's happening inside of the control plane. So this is on for you by default. And then you can also see all of the different Kubernetes services here, even if we take a look at the queries here itself. So if we click on queries, we can go to audit here and we can run some workloads. Now, as you can see, this came directly from, if we go ahead and we click back again, and then we go to audit, this came directly from the audit log, and this is a readiness status per your node. So again, we'll go ahead and we'll run that, and then we can see some log output here. So this is on by default for us in AKS. However, in AWS, for example, and I'm not going to go through and create this whole EKS cluster, but in step 3 for any EKS cluster creation, you're able to configure logging. And if I want to, I need to turn on the audit logging in EKS. I need to turn on the API server logging. So by default, those things are not on. Again, it's going to depend on the environment that you're in. It's going to depend on what you're running, how you're running it. If you're running a bare Kubernetes cluster, if you're running a KubeADM cluster, it's all going to depend on where you're running it. And that's audit logging in a nutshell for Kubernetes. Thank you so much for watching.